United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secured. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. Through days dark and stormy, while great Lenin led us, our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above, and Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build the land that we love. We fought for the future, destroyed the invader, and brought to our homeland the laurels of fame. Our glory will live in the memory of nations, and all generations will honor her name. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. For the future, destroyed the invader, and brought to our homeland the laurels of fame. Our glory will live in the memory of nations, and all generations will honor her name. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live the people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Midwestern Mark stream. We got all sorts of people in here already. Apparently, late at night is a good time to stream. Me and Carlos just decided to hop on the live late at night and talk about philosophy and politics. Sort of impromptu, but this should be fun. Glad to see everyone here. How's it going, Carlos?
It's going good, man. I love starting it off with that Paul Robeson rendition of the Soviet national anthem. It's so good. His voice was amazing, and if you look into his life, I don't know if you can have a more Renaissance man to point to. He did it all. He was an all-star in football, in theater. He was a beast. He was one of the most well-known people in the world, and he was a communist. And he spoke like 20 languages, which I just recently found out Engels did too, which makes me feel kind of bad. I only speak two. But he was a genius, and it's one of those cases where we only do not know much of him, and he's been relegated as a celebrity just for communists, basically, because of McCarthyism, because of both racism, but specifically anti-communism, which has relegated one of the most impressive American people in the history of the country to basically oblivion for popular consciousness. And let's hope that changes after the socialist revolution.
Definitely, he's certainly a figure to recapture. He did a lot of amazing things. One of my favorite videos, of his, but one of my favorite videos ever, is his HUAC testimony, the House on Un-American Committees. Just an egregious anti-freedom of speech, freedom of political expression, everything that America supposedly stands for, built right into the government. Just an anti-communist organization that would witch hunt communists. And you see, like, in his testimony, the double-edged sword of racism that they're utilizing against him, combined with the anti-communism, and just accusing him of being, a stooge of the Soviet Union or whatever, because he was praising the Soviet Union, which was, far less racist at the time than the U.S., and was, doing things to raise people out of poverty and whatnot. So, and they've tried to erase him from history, but he's certainly an incredible figure. And in that HUAC testimony, he was so articulate in explaining his views, making these government interrogators sound like fools almost, pretty much throughout the entire thing. So, that's great. I'm glad we were able to open the show with that.
They also ask him, one of the things they ask him in the HUAC interview, not ask him, but one of the things they tell him, he's like, they're like, how are you oppressed? You did all of these great things in college. I watched you play football. You graduated with a law degree. You did all of this. What sort of oppression are you talking about? And he gives a great response, which is that, I cannot measure the condition of my people based on my individual success. And that shows, I think, the sort of consciousness that we should have, especially at a time when liberalism and woke identity politics has reduced the liberation of oppressed and marginalized communities to merely representing diverse faces in high places. We have to remember the words of Paul Robeson that, just having people of color, Black folks, indigenous folks in high places is not liberation, right? That does absolutely nothing for the vast majority of people from oppressed and marginalized communities that are part of the working class and that are suffering the same ills as white workers are. So that sort of spirit that, we're not free as individuals until all of us are free, I think it's something that's worth recapturing in our woke neoliberal age of capitalism.
Yeah, I think he is a good example of striving for personal success, I guess greatness and development, which I saw an argument going on Twitter recently where people were saying, like, I think they were saying Chinese communists, emphasize, doing well and being successful in whatever, walk of life you choose to do and working hard at it. And they were saying that should be a virtue for people who are socialists or communists, to try and work hard and do well and succeed in whatever you're doing. Which I think is good, and I think it makes sense. And obviously we're alienated in a lot of things we do under capitalism. But, if you have a talent like Paul Robeson that's able to reach that many people, definitely use it. But then, it's easy to forget the liberation of the masses. It's easy to just be like, all right, I'm rich, I made it, I'm above the people now. And I know our friends over at RBN were heavily criticizing Jay-Z recently for, preaching that individualistic celebrity, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mindset. And that's something Paul Robeson never adopted. He always remained a man of the people, always remained a freaking tanky. Like, talk about telling the truth in the face of McCarthyism, and a government agency called the House on Un-American activities that would hunt down communists. So yeah, shout out to a real one, as they say.
That takes a hell of a lot of courage, which is something that, as you mentioned, we tend to look down, and it's somewhat understandably. I think it's a reaction to, in some communist spaces, is a reaction to what liberals do to the problems of exploitation, or to the problems of war or climate change, whatever it is, that they individualize it, right? Just change your consumptive practices, et cetera, et cetera. And the critique of that individualized solution to systemic problems leads some people to say that, look, whenever we bring up ethical transformations or a virtue ethic, a communist virtue ethic that we can develop, we're doing that thing that liberals do. We're making it individualized. And that's not the case, right? And that's based on a very one-sided understanding of what the hell an individual even is, right? The Marxist tradition shows us, that individuals are but ensembles of relations. The individual is always in a relation with their community, and when the individual changes themselves, they're participating in a dialectical transformation of their community. That's why the ethical and the political is always dialectically interrelated and interpenetrative. And so an ethical transformation, of course, it's 100% necessary for the revolutionary vanguard to be capable enough to do its historical task of taking the working class to power. And the Chinese are very clear with this, right? In Roland Bohr's excellent book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, an introduction for foreigners, he depicts towards in one of the latter chapters the importance of virtue ethics in China. And we're not talking about like old school Aristotelian virtue ethics, although it's still, I think, valuable. I love teaching it, but we're talking about a communist-centered virtue ethics that sees virtue as always tied to the advancement of human liberation and of the liberation of the working class and the toiling masses. So I think that's, of course, something that we have to recapture. And one of the first things we ever published in Midwestern Marx was a translation of that Che speech that he gives to the youth, where he's basically telling them,
bring that up.
Right, he's basically telling them, strive to be the best in everything you do, whether it's the classroom, whether it's sports, whatever it is. Strive to be the best and to give it your all. Not in a cutthroat way like we do in capitalism, where competition is about bringing others down, but do your best, strive to be the best, while also bringing your comrades up, your classmates up, your teammates up. And I think that's something that's absolutely fundamental to communists today. And, you can translate it anywhere, as a student, as an athlete, in your workplace. Don't be the guy that, they're half-assing makes your coworker work more. Be the guy that takes up the load, and that, it's the person that all your other coworkers can look up to. That's
Right.
how you lead by example, and that's what a vanguard's supposed to be doing.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you to Tusker for the $20 super chat. You guys should popularize History of the Communist Party of Soviet Union Bolshevik short course written by Stalin. Great theoretical work that needs to be studied widely. All right.
That's where
Have you read that, Carlos?
That's I've read parts of it. Like when you read Dialectical and Historical Materialism, it's usually nowadays printed just as a pamphlet, but that was a part of the 4th chapter of that history that Stalin did.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tusker. I'll have to check that out myself. Maybe do some videos about it. Yes, Stalin is so underrated, says Angie. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I put off reading Stalin forever. I don't know if it was like the last vestige of anti-communism, like shafted deep in my brain, but I just was reading everything else before Stalin, Lenin, Marx, Engels, whoever else, and I picked up, and even Mao, Che, whoever, and then I picked up Stalin. I'm like, this is freaking great. This guy hits the nail on the head with everything. For the most part, Marxism and the national question, masterpiece, that basically explains the Marxist position on national self-determination, which is, an extremely important position if you're going to advocate for socialism in one country, and other things that Marxist-Leninists believe in. So yeah, shout out to Stalin. And another point I like to make, and Vijay makes this point. I don't know if he makes it with Stalin necessarily, but he definitely makes it with Ho Chi Minh, and with Mao, or maybe not Mao. I can't remember who else he makes it with, but people who Westerners especially say these people aren't theorists, right? These people never made Marxist theory. Maybe they put it into practice, but they never truly theorized anything. Or the more chauvinistic Western Marxists will say, their theory's just super simplistic and stupid and dumb, and you shouldn't pay any attention to it, even though they actually are leading socialist experiments. But what Vijay says, if you look at the Vietnamese experience closely, or the Cuban experience closely, or their attempts to build socialism, like all of that is theory, like the systems of welfare and of bringing healthcare and other necessary materials to rural areas of Vietnam that had been decimated in the Vietnam War, and had never really had access to those things like healthcare in the first place. The process of finding a way to devise an economy that works for the people, especially within the context of global capitalism and global imperialism, and especially for Vietnam, after being decimated by bombs, napalm, and Agent Orange in World War II, that's absolutely Marxist theory. Because what is theory other than the collective experience of the international working class in general? So everything that Mao and Ho Chi Minh and the workers and leaders under them recorded, and debated about and discussed, is absolutely part of Marxist theory. It's a living, breathing science to alleviate the ills of humanity, and the failures of capitalist production.
Right.
Son, facts. There you go.
I think that goes back to this tendency to separate theory from praxis, and say, the theory came out of the West, the practice came out of the East. And I think that's a big mistake, because some of the most major theoretical developments in Marxism out of the 20th century, with the exception of perhaps one, they all came out of the East. You have with Lenin the theory of imperialism. You have with Mao the development of the analysis of contradictions. Those are just tremendous developments. The theory of the Vanguard Party, which gets really concretized and refined in the East, it's just superb. And those are theoretical developments that grow again out of a dialectical interaction of thinking and acting, which is what we call the concept of praxis, which I know you're reading Hegel now. It's something that's comes out of Hegel, right? But I wanted to just make a couple comments with respect to Stalin. The chapter in the book that was referenced earlier from the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the chapter on dialectical and historical materialism is basically the one that when Western Marxists criticize what they call Soviet Marxism, which is just absurd, to say that there's just one trend that a country that had millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people had. Everyone thought the same, even though 60% of the books were published there. Everyone thought the same. All the books said the same thing. But anyways, there's this trend that Soviet Marxism has, which is that whenever it criticizes this thing it calls Soviet Marxism, the only thing it appeals to is that short part of that one larger text, dialectical and historical materialism. And there are certain things that could be criticized rightfully, certain places where it's simplified. But overall, I agree with the assessment of Martin Nicolaus, who was, Western Marxist. He was the person that first translated Marxist Grundrisse to English. And he said that Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism, for all the small flaws it has here and there, is really, really good as a pedagogical tool, as a teaching tool. And it was used, I think, not in this past one, but in the previous Little Red Schoolhouse for the Communist Party. And it's used all across the world for teaching people both dialectics and historical materialism. It has flaws in both parts. For instance, in the section on dialectics, it doesn't talk about the negation of the negation, which was then opportunistically used by the Western Marxists to say that that's because Stalin felt that no revolution was ever possible again. Because in Marxist Capital, when he refers to the knell of capitalist private property bursting asunder, the law, the dialectical law that he refers to, is the law of the negation of the negation. And by Stalin not having that law there, they took it to mean that he was just a totalitarian that didn't want revolutions to occur or anything or something like that. But it has its flaws, but it's a wonderful text, and he also intervened in the linguistic debates that were going on in the Soviet Union concerning the question of whether language is a part of the superstructure. He had very good and mature and serious thoughts with regards to that. And of course, Fundamentals of Leninism is a terrific text to understand the basics of Marxism Leninism. So
That is a great one. That one's underrated too,
right. As a thinker, he's fantastic.
for sure. And Manifest Destiny. Thank you very much for the $4.99. Our other friend Iwido said that's such a lowball question, lol. I think in reference to this, which may be so, but definitely down to answer this. What's your opinion that anarchists that claim existing socialist states like Nicaragua and China are not pure enough for them? Well, I heard an anarchist recently who I don't mind. He's not the worst. He's definitely like a Marxist, but basically the way he described it was Lenin was good. Lenin organized the workers overthrew the state, but then Lenin became bad because he wrote the NEP and said we need state capitalism to transition to communism, and that's where he splits with Lenin, this anarchist. It's like, well, what do you want? Like what are they supposed to do? It's like if they didn't adapt like this and do quote unquote state capitalism, they would be destroyed. And he's like, give all the powers to the workers, but they did have worker Soviets, or I mean that's what the Soviets were like a decentralized form of worker control, which Stalin wanted to increase and increase democracy in those and increase economic power and control of the Soviets for direct worker control. Which was thrown out by Khrushchev and his guys. So, this decentralized, perfect form of socialism that the anarchists imagine, where we abolish capitalism overnight, I think it's anti-Marxist. They're not being realistic, and they're not recognizing the gains that have been made in countries like Nicaragua and China. Like Vijay Prashad says, the amount of people in poverty in India today are the number of people, is less than the number of people that China has pulled out of poverty. So if India was a socialist country rather than a neoliberal country, they may have been able to do that kind of construction and bring that many people out of poverty the same way China did. Nicaragua, same thing. These systems of rural welfare that they've constructed, bringing resources to rural areas and especially bringing healthcare to rural areas has massively increased life expectancy, massively increased access to education, decreased illiteracy, done lots of things for the people. So I feel like anarchists are just dismissing that. And that's why it's usually Westerners, because, most people in the West have never lived outside of industrialization. Right, like a lot of people in Nicaragua and China at the time of the revolutions were like peasants, or basically peasants, and they're, most people in the West can't even understand that unless you like live in the poorest parts of Appalachia. So that's where I think a lot of anarchism comes from. It's just liberalism and individualism at the end of the day. And Stalin also has good work on socialism versus anarchism, since we're on a Stalin kick.
Right. Jose Carlos Mariátegui, perhaps one of the more famous Marxist theoreticians of Latin America, he used to call liberalism the left wing, anarchism the left wing of liberalism. And when you look at, in terms of outlook, how it is that they approach the world, they might have different conclusions with the liberals, but that approach to the world, that Weltanschauung, that outlook, that worldview, is essentially the same. They have at their core this purity fetish, that if something's not pure enough, if something doesn't match up to their idea of what this ideal society ought to be, they reject it. And that's the same thing that liberals do. It's the same thing that most Western Marxists, particularly the ones in academia, the same thing that they do. But the facts are undeniable, right? Especially when you look at the facts in a dialectical manner. You examine the factors and the interconnections and the development that led to the facts. They're undeniable. The people in China and the people in Nicaragua are living substantially, just two completely different worlds from before and after their revolution. I mean, it's insane. I would say that the living standard in most Chinese cities right now is a hell of a lot higher than in the United States. I don't think Nicaragua's there yet, but they're getting there under immense pressure from American sanctions, from American imperialism, under a history that has polarized their nation because of the funding of the Contras. And these both of these experiments, one which is led by a communist party, the other which is not, but which believes in a form of Christian socialism, both of these experiments have as the basis of their governance, as the basis of their economic and civil policy, the promotion of human flourishing. What's at their core is the development of the human being, creating the conditions so that the human being can improve themselves as much as possible, culturally, economically, in every sphere of life. And that's socialism. And they might not have the perfect markers, they might have still privatized parts of their economy, but they're increasing the living standards of their people at rates never before seen in history. And to point at that and say, look, they're not pure enough for me to accept them, it's just infantilism. That's all. It's infantilism, and it shows that you're living, as Vijay Prashad told David Harvey once, on the other side of imperialism. If you were on the other side of imperialism, if you're affected by imperialism, you would definitely realize that you would much rather be born in China than in India, right? You would much rather be born in Nicaragua than in a
Honduras.
than in,
Honduras, right next door.
I was going to say pre-Xiomara Castro, because hopefully Honduras changes, but and goes back to what it was under Manuel Zelaya. But a few months ago, before that victory, you can have that comparison. Look at Nicaragua, look at Honduras, and there you would see the difference. One country has the highest crime rates in the whole region. The other one has virtually no crime.
Yep. And I mean, the sanctions that the U.S. puts on Nicaragua are underrated. We talk about Venezuela and Cuba a lot, but, this is on the U.S. government's own website here that I pulled up. Look at all these press releases, sanctions on specifically Nicaragua's state mining company, talking about holding them responsible for oppression. It's literally just when they nationalize companies and use them to fund social welfare programs or healthcare in rural areas, the U.S. says, oh, it's, dictatorial, it's authoritarian because they're cracking down on businesses and the freedom of businesses, so we can sanction them and just pirate their resources. And that's the context that Nicaragua is trying to build socialism, and that you can't just snap your fingers and make that go away, which is something I think anarchists miss too. Brandong says Jackson Hinkle and Tucker Carlson, let's get Eddie on there next. Tanky's rising. I agree. I will go spread so much communist propaganda on Tucker Carlson. Absolutely. I saw some people who were mad at Jackson for going on. And let me be the first to say I do not agree with everything Jackson says. His position on Andrew Tate, by example. I do not like Andrew Tate. I do not think Andrew Tate is helpful. Andrew Tate suggests that people just go off of their individual experience, or actually his individual experience, and not read books. It pisses me. He also just says a lot of misogynistic, like, neither here nor there. But Jackson went on Tucker Carlson and talked about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum, and talked about things that are important to communists and socialists, to the biggest cable media news show in the entire country. So, why would you not take that platform and use it to talk about communism? And, think what you want of Jackson's cultural takes, I guess, and his social positions. And like I said, I disagree with some. But he's always talking about, healthcare, ending the wars, the military-industrial complex, the World Economic Forum, the big banks, the big corporations. He's ultimately hitting on the stuff that communists and working-class people care about. So why not go spread that on the world, literally the country's most popular news show? It actually kind of seems silly to me that we wouldn't be pragmatic enough to use that tool if it's offered to us, regardless of who their audience is. Because what's their audience going to get otherwise? Right-wing garbage.
Right, and it's that purity fetish, but how it manifests itself at home. If someone doesn't have the perfect views, or what you consider to be your perfect views, which means if someone doesn't have the views that on every little box check in a form that they think completely in line with you, they're absolutely rejected. And I think that's childish. I mean, Jackson has done terrific work with Ukraine. Brought insane guests on to speak. He's done awesome work with Ukraine. He's done a lot of good work on other stuff. And like you said, there's probably quite a few things that we disagree with him on. But is it worth like not collaborating, or do I think he's a negative force for some of those negative things? I don't think so. And we have to remember, what people's roles are, right? Jackson, I don't know if he labels himself as this, but I would consider him some form of a journalist or a popular communicator. He's not a theorist, right? He's not a theorist. He's not someone who's sitting down, reading the 24/7, analyzing reality, and he doesn't have to have everything perfect. So a lot of these questions, these practical disagreements, I think, as a philosopher, they're all rooted in a lack of a proper dialectical materialist analysis, and you can't blame a journalist for having that. Like the same thing with Ben Norton. There's a lot of stuff I agree with him on. There's a lot of other stuff that I don't agree with him on, but he's a journalist. The same thing with Glenn Greenwald. You shouldn't go to Glenn Greenwald or Jackson Hinkle or Ben Norton to get your theory. You should go to theorists who will prepare you by giving you the method through which you can get to conclusions on your own. But it's great to listen to them when they talk about politics, when they talk about the news. And, that's how I approach the world. I don't expect everyone that I engage with to have perfect ideological alignment with myself, because I understand that I myself have changed my views on various things. And when you realize that you can also be wrong whenever, and when you have that sort of Cartesian spirit of constantly doubting where you're at in order to reconstruct the fact that you're right about your beliefs, when you have that spirit, you don't look at other people and shame them and cancel them, because you realize that they too can change, right? We all changed, and to get to where we're at now, other people can change as well. And that sort of openness, I think, is a bit more mature when it comes to interpersonal relationships and organizing and relating yourself to other organizations or other political figures.
Yeah, I think especially when you're talking about organizing, which should be mostly professional. And I don't know what Ben Norton thinks of us, and like you said, there's disagreements, but I'll always recommend, Multipolarista is great journalism. It's great anti-imperialist journalism. We used his article about Sri Lanka the other day. It was fantastic. He, created a really easily digestible infographic of where Sri Lanka's debt was going and how it was not China who was debt trapping them, counter to the, U.S. corporate media claims. And it's like, why dismiss this, because you have certain disagreements with Ben on theory when, like you said, he's not a theorist. His job is to put together great infographics like this and provide good information, for theorists and others to use. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And shout out to Ben Norton as well. Dixon Software Solutions. Love the content. Keep it up. Well, thank you. $25.
Thanks, comrade.
Big spender. Thank you. I'm glad you believe in what we're doing. We'll put it to good use and try and keep educating people. Thank you very much.
All right. I was able to see the interview, and he, although in terms of phrasing, of course, there was things that, I would say differently. I think he pretty much kept the focus on the overlaps between Joe Biden and the Democratic, the DNC governance, and Zelensky. And I think that exposing the lies of Ukraine and exposing the lies of Ukraine is objectively anti-imperialist, because what's being waged in Ukraine is a proxy war against Russia. So if you're exposing those lies, if you're talking about the Azov Battalion, the influence of Nazism, the role that the U.S. has there, and how some of the actions maybe taken at home overlap with those, I think that's largely something positive to do. Would we do it differently? Sure, but I don't think it's worthy of hate. But then again, I went to a private Catholic school. We both did, so maybe we're more open to not hating a lot of people for their beliefs.
In the middle of Iowa, too, in the Midwest. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is that there's no like strong alternative like third or socialist party right now. You have CPUSA and PSL, um, but there's always a handful of contentions or issues that people have when you bring those parties up. Which fair, and I think the answer is to get in those parties and make them truly representative of the working class and the revolutionary working class. But and those parties do a lot of great work too. Not to take anything away from them. I'm in CPUSA, but yeah, it's hard for Jackson to go on and be like, all right, Joe Biden sucks. The Republicans suck. Also, join CPUSA right now and let's organize. Because the movementism, I guess, all people's energy is kind of put into protests and sort of political protest movements. There's no real strong organ of working class political power nationally right now, despite the parties who are doing good community organizing. So I don't know. I feel like you could use the media more effectively if we started to develop and build a party like that, or a labor movement like that, union movement like that.
Right. And, not saying Hinko is Lenin, but do you think that if Lenin was invited to go on a show that is, on average, you know, has 2 to 3.5 million people tuned in, do you think Lenin would reject that? Going on and saying positive things. Like they did the same thing with Chris Smalls when he went on, but he did a really good job when he went on. Of course, Tucker was trying to politicize certain things, and that's normal. But he stuck to a good script that was pro worker and that didn't fall for some of the other things that Tucker was trying to get him to fall into. But I think either way, whenever you can reach working people through whatever medium, I think that's the way to go. Like the motto from Malcolm X, by any means necessary, which was actually in Fanon before. But anyways, that motto I think is good. Any means you can use to reach the mass of people is one that you should use. If you're able to convince just one person out of those 3.5 million to be more open to socialism by going on that, and again, that's not what I'm saying that Jackson was doing. He was focusing on Ukraine, which I think it's fine. But if you can convince just one person, you've done a hell of a whole lot, especially when for people that have experience organizing on the ground, just changing one person's mind is very hard. And we have a medium that allows us to speak to, hundreds, thousands, millions of people sometime.
And people who don't have political ideas concretely formed yet.
Right. And with Tucker, because of, the way that the right is, they like to exploit in their discourse some of the very real problems that people are facing. So you see with Tucker every once in a while these clips that start to make their rounds across social media where he says things that sound socialistic or that sound like genuine criticisms of anti-imperialism. And I don't think a lot of them are genuine, but I don't really think it matters because it's opening people to ideas that then we can go there and hammer it out and make coherent and take them to where they actually have to be. They're not going to get anything emancipatory from Tucker Carlson. But if we go on there and they like us enough to follow us elsewhere, then, something could happen. But yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think people forget sometimes too, like the peasants in Russia were the more like reactionary section of the working mass. Am I correct? Like as far as their views, there was more reaction and bigotry among the peasant class. But Lenin was saying we still need to go to them and make them part of the revolution and educate them and eventually even proletarianize them, I guess. But now you have so many people who have ML in their Twitter bio or whatever, Marxist Leninist, and they do a lot of canceling and talking about not reaching out to people who have certain views or whatever else. And it's like don't think that is in the spirit of Lenin. I think he would want us to reach out to people who watch Fox News, to be honest with you. I've convinced people who watch Fox News to be socialists. There's a lot of them in the place where I grew up. So, yeah. We got another super chat here from Tusker. I like your otter profile pic, by the way, Tusker. Thank you. That's very nice. The liberal bourgeoisie was not interested in the complete victory of the revolution, for it needed the czarist regime as a whip against the workers and peasants, whom it feared more than anyone else. Stalin. Absolutely. Stalin and Lenin, I think, had a really, really good analysis of the Russian Revolution. That's worth reading for everyone, because there's so much. Because you got to remember, it started as like a popular revolution, so they had this peasant class. They didn't have a fully capitalist society yet, and they had a monarchy, via the czar system. So they had a popular revolution where the liberals were on board, the bourgeoisie was on board, the peasants and the proletariat. And then, I think Stalin or Lenin describes it as like a revolution in 3 stages or 3 separate revolutions, where then you have the proletariat and peasants at the end come through and fully crush the czarist regime. And any chance at a dictatorship of capital taking over Russia. So this is really interesting, worth reading. And I think like it changed the way I was thinking about a lot of things. Because you realize what a popular revolution would be in the U.S. There would be so many different groups coming together who disagree with each other so much. And that's what it was happening in Russia. But then if you can organize a strong, theoretically educated working class party that's hitting on all the issues that are important to the working class and really organizing them and rallying them around that, you can turn that popular revolution into an actual socialist revolution, even if you don't have 90% of the country supporting socialism or whatever. So it kind of gives you a more realistic perspective on organizing politics and revolution, I think, as far as understanding what a popular revolution is and like how close we could be to that in the US, right? Like, you already have kind of crazy petty bourgeois QAnon people like storming the Capitol. Like, you could have some kind of popular revolution pop off at any minute. So got to be ready and organized and educating people about socialism.
Right. I wanted to respond to one of the messages here. Since we know fascists will use class struggle in their messaging, how do we know if someone is using us? As communism becomes more popular, we will get people co-opting that messaging, and I think that's correct. Every development of fascism, it's hard to pin down because each one has, of course, its own specific, unique, concrete characteristics. But almost always, it uses the dissenting attitudes that are naturally produced when capitalism comes into moments of crisis. It uses those in a paradoxical way in order to enforce the existing order through the strong hand of capital. And I think the essence of what we're saying is not that you can try to win over the spokespeople that function as the ideologues, right? I mean, fuck them, not that you should.
Right. We're not telling you to reach out to Richard Spencer.
Right. Not that you should
go to hell.
for these ideologues of what is an objective material force that's supported by the most reactionary segments of finance capital. But there's a lot of working people that are fooled by this. And if we're honest about our theory and our concrete understanding of the world, there is no way in hell that it is in the interest of the working class to join the fascist forces. And there is no way in hell that it is in the interest of workers to pin themselves against one another on the basis of race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, etc. There's no way in hell where that's true. The interest of the working class, regardless of who it is in uniting, sometimes uniting with other popular forces like the peasants and parts of the intellectuals and parts of the petty bourgeoisie. And it's uniting with other popular forces in the struggle against the big monopolists and in the struggle against the bourgeoisie and the owning classes. So if we really believe that, there's no way in hell that when presented with the opportunity of speaking in front of people who are working class and who are being fooled into these fascistic ideas, we shouldn't take advantage of that, not to create alliances with the fascist forces, but to persuade the fascistically leaning workers or ideologically fascistically leaning workers to your side. We have this tendency in the US, and I think it's in the West in general, to associate forces with just individual identification, right? So in the West, you call yourself a communist, but in the East, in China, if you call yourself a communist, it means that you're part of the Communist Party. So you have a lot of fascistically minded workers that are not like active in like a fascist party or something, or actively being the agents of the most reactionary sectors of finance capital, but that are just flirting with those ideas. And those ideas, as we know, are a result of moments of crisis that are then exploited to defend capitalism itself. So we should always get to workers. There's no workers there's no part of the working class that I think is irredeemable. You can change the mind of everybody, and I've experienced it. I know it's anecdotal, but I've experienced it in my personal life. One of the people who was the most serious organizer I've ever met in my life, one of the most dedicated people I know. He has a hammer and sickle tattoo on his arm with the pride flag, and under it says proletariat. That was a person that was in very far right circles when they were in high school and when they were very young, and they were brought out of that by people who knew that because he was working class, objectively his interests were against all of the beliefs that he had. So hell yeah, we should get to as many workers as possible, and if that means using a platform like Tucker's, I think we should do it.
And that person has turned so many other people into communists
So
and
many.
organizers, and has done so much work on the ground and unionizing. He's been fired for unionizing workplaces just recently, like absolute beast. So yeah. Good question here from Left is Best. I haven't been following the situation in Chile super closely, but I mean, I have been following Boric from a geopolitical perspective, as in what Gabriel Boric, the recently elected sort of social democratic leader of Chile, has been talking about. And you say, how can they afford further failures moving forward? I think at a minimum, indigenous representation in all levels of government is a must. I would agree with you, just because a huge percentage of the indigenous population in Latin America is working class or part of the working mass, historically oppressed, and yeah. But I mean, I would say ultimately, though, it's a class thing. Like, they need more working class representation in their government. Like, there were so many things that I want to talk about Gaddafi a little bit later that he did in Libya. There's so many things that Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution, though, have done to increase worker democracy, to like bring these decentralized sort of, to use a more anarchist word, I guess, but forms of power. I guess that could be a communist word too, but these decentralized forms of popular government to where people can be making the decisions. And so, like, even say crafting a constitution that's exactly in their image, they would have more say in what the constitution actually looks like, rather than having, some social democratic, environmentalist sort of hipster-esque politicians, whom, are better than the right-wing fascists they were running against, which is why we supported them during the elections. But, having them write up a constitution and then offer it to the people. So I think it stems from the Social Democrats not basing themselves in the working class as much, which, exactly like you're saying, would be the indigenous population of Chile. So, which is what, like, the Bolivarian Revolution has done so successfully. When you had the first indigenous presidents with Chavez and Maduro. So. Do you
Right.
want to have this one, Carlos? I'm sure you'll have a better answer than me.
I've not been following extremely closely, but I have been following it a bit, and I know that the Constitution.
The voters rejected it. Sorry, I should have explained what happened. I thought I brought this up.
The Constitution was quite progressive. It had a lot of good things with respects to indigenous people, with respects to the environment, education, social services. There was a lot that was quite good in it. It was crafted in part with the Socialist Party that Boric, which is Social Democratic Party that Boric is a part of. I know the Communist Party over there was a part of crafting it, but it was rejected. It was rejected by a lot, either yesterday or the day before. The days are blurring, but and the question is why? And everything that I've been able to hear from comrades who have close relationships with party members in Chile is that there was two central flaws. The first one is that the language of the Constitution, because it was crafted so quickly, was not done in the interest of having the vast majority of people understand what the fuck was being said. So there was words being used like plurinationalism and gender expression, which were then exploited by the means of communication, which of course were in the hands of private interests that have their interest directly correlated to continuing the Pinochet constitution and the neoliberal order in Chile. So I think that gives us an insight into discourse. What sort of discourse should we be using and prioritizing? What sort of discourse should be okay for like academic interactions, and what sort of discourse should we bring to the masses at a popular and somewhat impersonal level as trying to pass a constitution is. And Jacobin, I think either Jacobin or a project related to Jacobin, but they've shown studies that in the U.S., when you start to get jargony, you start to lose people. When you stay with the bread and butter issues, with bread and butter questions and language about economics, about people's everyday means of subsistence, people are much more receptive to a radical program than if you start throwing out these academic words. They just start alienating people, and it's been statistically proven. And I think that the analysis coming out of the communists in Chile is that in part that was it. But in another part, I think it's important to emphasize something that you and I, Eddie, have written about in the past, which is the state, right? The state, and thinking about the state in a Gramscian form as an integral state, as something that contains not just the apparatuses of domination and of political governance, but also the apparatuses of civil society, the media, the means of communication. And when these are in the hands of the bourgeoisie, regardless of whether a socialist party is in power or not, socialism cannot ultimately triumph. In order for socialism to triumph, there needs to be a radical transformation of the state, of civil society, of everything, because these are bourgeois instruments that sometimes it can be wielded for socialism, but in the long run, they can be used to pull socialist progress and development, to pull the rug under it. So I think that, for instance, the means of communication played a major role. The major media were distorting what was in the Constitution, in the proposed reforms, and that convinced a hell of a lot of people. That's why it was a pretty bad defeat for the constitutional proposal. So if we want socialism, we need to be serious about actually transforming the how a state is constituted and which forces are the ones that dominate the state, civil society, and everything else.
Right, and like I said, Boric is ultimately from the educated middle class social democrat, anti Cuba, anti Nicaragua, their dictatorships. And we supported him in the election because he was better than the far right winger he's running against. But yeah, he hasn't transformed the telecommunications, the media, and then that's utilized against him. And then like you bring up some specific concrete examples, but like I said, he's a middle class sort of environmentalist, or I guess you could compare him to like an AOC maybe in the US. I don't know, but maybe a little farther left or more. I don't know, but either way, so he's putting things about environmentalism and gender expression in the Constitution without explaining them, concretely to workers what they mean. Those get weaponized against him. It's just, as you said, an example of the bourgeois instruments of the state being used to sabotage socialism, being used to control the people. A socialist president not being able to control the state, which still acts as a dictatorship of capital. And then it shows, the failure of, like I said, at first, basing yourself truly in the working mass, the indigenous working masses, the people in the countryside, the people in the cities, rather than, educated academics who probably have better ideas than the right wingers. Not that there's anything wrong with us academics, of course, but, we got to base ourselves as academics in the working mass, which is easier said than done, of course. But Carlos, what do you think? Oh, actually, that's kind of a long video. We'll watch that later. I saw this cool video of Gaddafi the other day. You want to watch it? I don't know. Have you read The Green Book?
I have not, no.
Haven't? Okay. Either way, I mean it's short, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about this. But
I've seen your stuff on it, and obviously, we've talked about some of the ideas in it quite a bit. But yeah, I'm excited. I've seen some of the Gaddafi speeches, and a lot of them are pretty darn good. But yeah, let's watch it.
yeah, I like this one. This is from CNN. It's called Gaddafi. I am the leader of a revolution, not a country.
Talking about CNN, just real quick, I wanted to mention that part of the media attack wasn't just from within Chile; it was also from outside. The Washington Post published an article that has circulated social media quite a bit, in which they talk about how bad it would be if the new constitution passed, because they're considering nationalizing their lithium, and right now the lithium is open to privatization, which of course is the center of the neoliberal order. You liberalize within the country so that other countries, transnational corporations, can come in and privatize it, and take the resources of a country and super exploit their labor, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the sort of same dilemma that pushed the 2019 coup in Bolivia, lithium, right?
Shout out to Elon Musk. That's what I call innovation. Meddling in other countries so you can steal their lithium. He's really a man of the people.
Came to power in Libya in 1969. Long time ago. Do you have thoughts on who might succeed you?
لا يعني أنا تركت السلطة من عام 77.
I gave up power or authority since 1977.
عندما قامت الجماهيرية قامت سلطة الشعب.
Once this Jamahiriya was established, the state of the masses was established, the people's authority was also established.
وبالتالي من ذلك الوقت وأنا خارج السلطة.
Ever since that date, I am not in power anymore.
So you are not the leader of your country.
إذا أنت ما تقودش
لا
البلد.
أنا قائد الثورة مش قائد البلد.
I am the leader of the revolution, not the leader of the country.
There's still a revolution going on.
في ثورة ما زال مستمرة في ليبيا.
إيه.
Yes.
What's your proudest achievement?
هو قيام سلطة الشعب.
The establishment or the emergence of the people's authority.
ووضع حجر الأساس لعصر جديد في العالم وهو عصر الجماهيريات.
And laying down the cornerstone for the world, a new era. It's the era of the masses.
What was your biggest mistake? No one's perfect.
فيش حد كامل سيدي، في خطأ حصل.
أكيد يعني.
For sure mistakes.
Do you have a mistake that you wish you could do over?
يعني أنا أعترف أن في عدد من الأخطاء وقعت أكيد.
I admit, I confess that a number of mistakes happened.
يعني ممكن واحدة من الأخطاء اللي أذكرها أن إحنا كنا متحمسين لصناعة القنبلة الذرية من وقت ما قامت الثورة.
One of the mistakes that I may mention that ever since the inception of the revolution, we were very much enthusiastic and eager to have the nuclear weapon, to manufacture a nuclear bomb.
بعد كبرنا وبعد شفنا العالم كيف تغير لقينا هذا شيء مش مفيد.
After we have grown up and we have seen how the world has changed, we have seen that it is not beneficial.
You want to see all nuclear weapons gone.
تريد أن ترى كل الأسلحة النووية منتهية. نهاية لكل الأسلحة النووية.
What do you think of Ahmadinejad?
كيف يعني? What is the question about him?
Do you like him? Do you know him? What do you think of him?
يعني أنا ما نعرفهاش.
I don't know him. But any head of a state or any leaders of the peoples, they should be viewed from the perspective of view of their own people, whether their own people like them or don't like them, they are supporting them, not supporting them, they are with them or against them. This is how they should be viewed or how they should be.
Well, the world can have an opinion, though. Anyway.
مع هذا العالم ممكن يكون عنده رأي في القادة وفي الرؤساء.
يعني ما نقدرش احنا نكونوا أقدر على تقييم الحاكم من شعبه.
We cannot be in a position better to assess or value the leader or the president more than his own people can do so.
I like how he just kind of takes a jab at the imperialism, almost like implicit in the mindset of even a journalist. What's that dude's name? Larry David? Is that his name, right?
Larry
Something like
King,
that.
I think.
Larry King. Yeah, I'm stupid. Larry David's the actor. Larry King. Even Larry King, is not, I think he has good interviews and isn't like the most imperialist journalist in the world. Even Gaddafi's like, we should let, a country's people decide their leaders. And he's like, oh, well, the world can have an opinion. Like, well, America, can intervene if they're too bad, or we got to at least, talk about how evil all these enemies of the U.S. empire are. Whereas Gaddafi's just like, why don't we let the people decide? But one of the things I noticed or took away from where did I put it? I had the green book here, is Gaddafi's not a Marxist-Leninist. And the main way where he differs from Marx and Lenin is in the view on authority. In that he spends a lot of time criticizing how socialist countries have failed because they concentrated authority into, either it became too bureaucratic or turned against the people or whatever else. It was a problem of not maintaining the authority of the people. Essentially authority and political authority, economic authority. Was released from the people's hands, so he created all these new systems of people's democracy, which you can read about in the Green Book that he lays out. And basically, like he said there, he was the leader of the revolution in a way, but it was mostly the people because he gave all this power away right away. And then, you can criticize, I think his criticisms of maybe the Soviet Union and other failed socialist experiments are correct. Versus I feel like China, have kept state power and economic power in the hands of the people. Countries like Cuba, and I think that's because you can criticize Gaddafi's view on authority based on the Marxist position on authority that, one class is going to utilize authority regardless. So you need a quote unquote dictatorship of the proletariat to use the government as a means to stop counter-revolution and mainly stop the imperialists in the case of Gaddafi. So, you could almost say that being so people-centric and, I don't know if he underestimated imperialism or not. It's hard to criticize him there, but I think the view on the authority is something to criticize there. Because you... and to make a concrete example, you hear him there talking about the nukes, right? And it's like, that sounds great. Who would want nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are terrible. But the DPRK got nuclear weapons, and, ever since the U.S. hasn't been able to invade them. And they haven't destroyed the country and turned it into a human rights disaster with no central government the way they've done to Libya. Versus Gaddafi rejects the nukes. And, North Korea was talking about denuclearization a while back. And John Bolton, who was in the administration at the time, I believe, literally said we're looking at following the Libya model with North Korea. Well, they're saying we're going to take out North Korea's government, literally leave them in an absolute disaster, human rights disaster, once they give up their nukes, the way that Gaddafi did. So you see the need, to keep a tight grip on authority, and be more quote unquote authoritarian when you're facing such horrible imperialism from the Western capitalists.
Right, and the proof is in the pudding. I mean, he was able to do tremendous things. It was the highest living standard in the whole continent of Africa. It was a wonderful experiment in African socialism, but he got killed. So if he had put himself at maybe developing authority and the security state perhaps a little more, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. And one of the things you get from the analysis of human rights in Marxism-Leninism that has been developed by people like Lusurdo and Roland Bohr and Carlos Martinez, Radhika Desai, and others, is that sovereignty is the most important thing. And to develop sovereignty, you need to have strong, developed productive bases strong development of technology, strong development in the sciences and your securities, in your military capacities, because that's how you protect sovereignty. And I think that, one of his mistakes is thinking that, trying to get nuclear weapons is a mistake. Unfortunately, that is the reality that countries that challenge U.S. NATO imperialism and that exists outside of the sphere of influence of imperialism, that's the reality they face. When you got a nuke, no one is going to fuck with you. And that's unfortunate, but revolutionaries don't pick what it is that they have to do. They're reacting upon the conditions that imperialism creates for them. And if you don't want the Libya model to be imposed on you, you have to do what the DPRK did, and that is develop nuclear weapons. It's unfortunate, but we can't blame them for doing that which was the only option for them to do in order to survive, because those conditions were imposed by imperialism on them. They're not the conditions that they chose to develop. No one who believes in such a humanistic and emancipatory project like socialism would ever want to develop just out of nowhere nuclear weapons or any sorts of weapons. But they realize that they have to do it in order to protect their popular revolutions. Those are conditions imposed by imperialism, not ones that they arrive at on their own spontaneously.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I was doing a TikTok about the Berlin Wall, or the anti-fascist wall in Germany, that separated East and West Germany, when the East was socialist. And I was quoting a Victor Grossman article that we published. He's a great journalist who grew up or not grew up, but studied journalism in the GDR. And he, the TikTok I made was responding to someone who's like, socialism's so good. What was the Berlin Wall? Why did they have to build a wall to keep people in? It's like, if you go into this quote unquote failures of socialism, or the places where socialism was authoritarianism, you realize how horrible imperialism is, the reason why they had to do this. And that, the reason they did this was to try and construct socialism. Like what the CIA said when they got access to all the leaked Soviet Union records that they had wanted to get access to for years after the dissolution. They were like, we thought they were doing everything because they were evil masterminds or dictators, but everything they did was because they actually were trying to build socialism. Even if it was stuff like the Berlin Wall, which if you look at the conditions as Victor Grossman explains them, East Germany was ravaged by the war. West Germany was having money pumped into it by the Marshall Plan. There was, essentially no border. And all the Nazis, of course, fled the East. So people were just leaving. They were just walking over. So they built a wall and, enforced the border, and also stopped all the, attempts of the U.S. to try and fund fascists and do various covert regime change attempts that we know they always do against socialist countries. Does that mean the Berlin Wall, or, the division of Germany in half is quote unquote good? No, I guess, it's a necessity. It's a necessity brought about by imperialism, or it was a necessity to maintaining sovereignty at the time, like you said, and trying to continue with the construction of the socialist project without having their country be sabotaged by imperialists. It eventually fell and the country was reunited, which is, it was a good moment for the country, even though it was, as Victor Grossman says, now 30 years later, neoliberalism is poured over the border, and people look back on the fall of the Berlin Wall in retrospect differently, because unemployment, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, all these negative things flowed back over the border. So, to argue that the Berlin Wall shows the failure of socialism because they had to trap people in, like, is just ridiculous. If anything, like that Victor Grossman article says, it shows the failure of capitalism, because what they thought was coming was freedom, and they were promised freedom, and what they got was unemployment and unregulated neoliberalism and homelessness and stuff like that. So, and they realized, there were protections in the socialist countries that they didn't have under capitalism that were in fact superior to capitalism. So these failures of socialism are like, the KGB, stuff like that, secret police designed to prevent imperialist infiltration, to protect sovereignty, to protect national security, we're like so used to our intelligence agencies in the U.S. murdering revolutionaries and overthrowing other countries that's just what we think all security apparatuses in every country do, but it's not the case. And not to say that we defend everything the KGB does, right? They're not necessarily morally good, but the existence of the KGB in history doesn't show that we can never do socialism or the Stasi or whatever.
Right. Imperialism is really good at getting these aesthetic symbols, at these sort of aesthetic facts that they can just pull out and run a narrative on, without analyzing the factors that led to those facts, and because they're a part of the factors that led to those sometimes ugly facts. And I think the wall is a good example of that. But also, with respect to Cuba, one of the strongest propaganda tools of imperialism with respect to Cuba is saying that socialism is so bad, people literally throw themselves in the ocean to come to the U.S. And it's fucked up because it fails to analyze, well, what are the conditions that led people to do that. And most people did that because there's objectively difficult conditions in Cuba that are created by a long history of colonialism, which I've covered in a class that I did for the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies that we've shared on Midwestern Marx. But that long history, and then of course the sanction regime of the American blockade on Cuba, which is again an internationally condemned blockade for the last 30 years. They forget to analyze that, and they also forget to analyze the fact that the Cuban government has no problem with people who don't want to be there leaving. It's the U.S. who has a problem. It is the U.S. that has their blockade not only prevent the access of visas to go to the U.S., to the Cuban people, but also they prevent them from being able to get visas to go to other countries. Because if they allow those people to go to those countries, then the relations that the U.S. has with those countries will prove unbeneficial for those countries. So they prevent people from going anywhere. They force them to stay trapped in a country that they're railing into poverty through sanctions and other activities and other covert activities. And then when the people are forced to throw themselves in the ocean, because the propaganda says that in the U.S. you live so good that every day is just eating steak at the pool and drinking beer. When the people do that, then they end up taking those images and saying, oh my God, look at how bad socialism is, and using the conditions and the things they created for atrocity propaganda. And I think the Berlin Wall is just another example of that.
Yeah, it's actually really sad in the case of socialism because people are tricked, and now you have a situation where, like, a lot of people are going back to Cuba, and tons of people have fled Venezuela, and the U.S. is spending so much money on propaganda. There is so much money spent on propaganda. The U.S. too spends so much money on propaganda, and our media apparatuses talk about how evil socialism is and how great capitalism is. And, imagine if you're an individual who grew up never seeing what capitalism's actually like, which is, the case with a lot of these socialist countries who underwent neoliberal shock therapy at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You're talking about a lot of people who have never, seen capitalism, which is why you have the old saying in the Soviet Union, everything they told us about communism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism was true. Because once capitalism came back to Russia, Romania, or East Germany, or wherever else, they were like, holy shit. Like 20% unemployment. And, it's really sad because we were covering the other day, Fulgencio Batista, the former dictator of Cuba, his daughter, granddaughter, whatever, is homeless in Florida. So that's just shows the we're told that Cuba was this great place under Batista, and capitalism so much better than socialism, and look how terrible socialism in Cuba is. It's like, well, at least they have houses. The former dictator's daughter of Cuba is homeless in Florida, capitalist Florida.
And they own their houses, right? 95% of Cubans own their houses. The other 5% only pays 6% of their paycheck towards rent. So I think that's a reality that most Americans do not experience, as we have more than 100,000 Americans living in the street when there's more than 20 times as many houses as homeless people that are available. But Yeah, I think it's important to analyze these tools of propaganda, because ultimately that's how people's minds are changed, and that's how people end up acquiescing to the existing order. That's how hegemony works. You have these massive institutions with a whole lot of power and a whole lot of money that do what they have to do in getting people whose interest is fundamentally antagonistic to the existing order to buy into it. And it is the task of socialists to convince them otherwise and to debunk all the nonsense that's on mainstream media and on social media and everywhere. And it's not something that it's one and done. You can talk to a person, convince them, then they go watch 40 hours of mainstream and media bullshit, go on social media, read a bunch of bullshit, and then they change their mind, right? You and I have friends that we've brought over to, when we were organizing for Bernie, that we took them from libertarians to communists. They were doing real good, and then they escaped from our wing because life takes them away to to other places, and you start to see slowly but surely the opinions go back to what it once was, and that's very sad. But it just shows that it's a constant process that we have to deal with in bringing people to our ideas and consistently touching base with them so that we know that they're still there.
Absolutely. Well, do you have anything else you want to talk about? I should
I do
probably
not.
get to
It's
sleep
pretty.
soon. I got to wrestle tomorrow morning, but
I have an early morning class I got to teach. So
for sure. Well, it was great talking with you. I'm glad we got to have this discussion. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out with us. Thank you to all the super chatters. Really, really appreciate your support. Yeah, follow us everywhere at Midwestern Marks.
I think this is the only context where like calling someone a super chatter is good.
Right. Usually, I feel like I'd be an insult.
Right. If you're in an office and you hear someone behind your back say, "Eddie's such a super chatter," you'd be so pissed.
I would.
In the
No one would
context,
ever say that about me at work, though. I never say shit.
right? Right. Well,
That's funny.
thanks for everyone who sticked along and listened to us talk about a variety of things, and thank you to all the super chats. That really helps.
For sure. Peace, everyone. Thank